Greetings everyone, welcome to the video lecture for HIC Chapter 5, and this chapter focuses on the process of policy making in Canada. We've mentioned several times in the course so far that the Canadian welfare system includes policies that shape the way we deliver services to people in order to improve their social welfare. And so this chapter focuses on the process of policy development. Policy development is described as a messy process, and it is. There are many different interests who are involved in the process of policy making, and ultimately a lot of decisions get made behind closed doors. People who are the most powerful, sometimes described as the power elites, people from banking, corporate interests, from government, usually have conversations about policy both formally and informally. Alliances are made and decisions are made in accordance with those alliances. So the policy process may be messy on the surface, but there are also a lot of hidden messy parts. The Constitution Act of 1867 is an important document in the policy-making process. It spells out the role of the federal government in policy making and divides up powers between the federal government and other levels of government and institutions. The post-World War II era was an era of expansion of social welfare policies and programs. The ending of the Second World War freed up a lot of resources within society. People who had fought in the war and returned home, and people who had made a lot of sacrifices during the war and engaged in work in war supporting activities like working in munitions factories, had an expectation that the resources that had been used to support the war would be reallocated to create resources and supports for citizens, so social welfare programs. There was also high inflation in the post-World War era and a baby boom, so there were a lot of pressure on things like the supply of housing. And so governments had to come up with a way to respond to these issues and concerns. And we know, for example, that housing programs and social housing communities were developed during this era in order to provide housing for people who had returned from the war and started families. The development of these kinds of programs meant that the federal government had to create relationships with the provinces in order to be able to deliver these services. And so there was an effort towards creating national standards that also responded to the specific needs and desires of people regionally. Programs like the Canada Assistance Plan were developed or honed in order to provide monetary support to the provinces for the delivery of these kinds of services and the development of these kinds of programs. The Canada Assistance Plan provided matching funds to provinces. So every dollar a province spent on social programs was repaid by the federal government. And so it provided the provinces with a fair amount of flexibility around spending and also some flexibility about the way in which they spent the money. But in about 1976, the era of retrenchment began in Canada. And by the 1990s, a significant number of the federal programs were changed quite significantly, including CAP. And you'll see more about that in the course material as we move forward. One of the problems with this kind of centralized model of delivering services is that it's complicated and slow. So the federal government decides they want to develop a program, and then they have to engage in some kind of consultation program with the provinces in order to see how and what it is that they need to do. And then the provinces have to agree to provide service at all, and then to provide service in ways that meet the outcome desires of the federal government. So oftentimes this can change or alter the particular policy goals or objectives developed by the federal government. We also know that lobbyists have the power to intervene in these situations and to influence the decisions of the federal government in ways that may not reflect the desire of people in particular regional areas. Some people also argue that the federal government uses federalism and the relationship with the provinces as a way of avoiding responsibility, deferring actual action, and, passing the buck, as Hick describes. federalism relies on this connection with the provinces to actually deliver and administer programs. So this relationship is sometimes described as a relationship of weak federalism because while power is centralized, the fact that the federal government has to negotiate with the provinces in order to make programs happen mitigates some of the power that the federal government has. I mean, there are some times when the federal government can say, no, actually, you're absolutely going to have to do this. But they don't want to do that all the time because then they would seem to be a very authoritarian government. And the government wants to be seen as a government that reflects the desire of the people. And of course, the provinces are a bit closer to the people, so they argue that they are better able to represent the needs and desires of the citizenship. But there is the power among the provinces to opt out of delivering certain programs and services. And this power means that particular provinces don't have to participate in federal programs. They can elect to create their own, a program that they feel, again, better reflects the needs of their citizens. And so if we look at the Canada Pension Plan, we know that the partner to the Canada Pension Plan is the Quebec Pension Plan. And so Quebec has its own pension plan administered at the provincial level. And certainly we've heard rumblings that Ontario is considering doing the same, but we'll see whether they do or not. So the tensions that exist between the federal and provincial governments can certainly play out in terms of the actual delivery and design of programs and provinces' willingness to do particular things on behalf of the federal government. Municipal governments also play a role in providing services. If we look at Ontario Works, for example, we know that in many municipalities, it's actually the municipality that provides those services. And those services fall under the jurisdiction of the provinces. But every province in Canada has to develop some kind of a social welfare program. That's a commitment that they have made to the federal government. In some cases, governments at the provincial level have a much stronger hold on the kinds of services that are administered and delivered, whereas in other provinces, the municipalities play more of a direct service role or have greater influence over the actual design of the programs they provide. We've been talking about the federal government, provincial governments, and municipal governments as the locations of social welfare policy delivery and development. But we also have to talk about globalization and the global context of social policies. In a Canadian context, we're active members, participants in the United Nations. And these relationships with global bodies like the UN and the World Health Organization and the World Trade Organization, and so on, they have a very significant role in shaping the kinds of policies and programs that we deliver at the local level. A great example of this is the population health approach and the social determinants of health. This particular model uses big data research to talk about the relationships between social phenomena and the health of people. This model happened to be developed in a Canadian context and then offered up to the United Nations through the World Health Organization as a policy approach. This policy approach has been adopted at the global level, and now there is an expectation that all of the policies and programs and services that we develop in a Canadian context in relationship to health will relate in some way to this population health approach. So we might go to the doctor's office, which is indirectly administered by the local health information integration network, and the LIN might be related to the province, and the province might be related to the federal government through the Canadian Health Act. But really, the kind of health care that we're receiving, the way in which we're receiving it, the way in which it's been talked about and measured relates to the population health approach. So globalization has a very significant role to play in our approach to delivering social welfare programs and policies. We also know that at the global level, partnerships between corporations and governments have a significant influence on the kinds of programs and services that are delivered. In a Canadian context, some of these relationships may be a bit more at arm's length, but in other places, the relationships are very close. The fact that these kinds of relationships are encouraged or supported puts pressure on the kind of public system that we have in Canada. And so it's something that we need to think about. Corporations have the power to influence or alter the social welfare services and infrastructure in a couple of different ways. First of all, the corporations have particular kinds of power about making particular kinds of arguments about what are desirable ways of doing things. And oftentimes, they have the ear of government. So they're able to influence the kinds of decisions that are made by government. But we also know that the slow privatization of a number of different social welfare infrastructures in Canada, for example, there are some things in healthcare that have been privatized, like, say, for example, blood labs, that these organizations can make particular arguments about the way in which service should be delivered based on the technologies that they use, and that these kinds of approaches can become the standards within the system rather than in other kinds of independent research being conducted to determine what it is that we want and how it is best to achieve that. Canada has entered into a number of free trade agreements. Perhaps the most commonly discussed is the North American Free Trade Agreement, but we've also entered into trade agreements with China, with countries in South America, and so forth. These trade agreements shape particular policies by making arguments about where and from whom we can and must purchase particular services, as well as setting trade export level limits or trade export level minimums. And so arguments can be made by other governments about the way in which the social welfare infrastructure in Canada can be seen as a trade supplement. For example, the US made arguments that in Canada, corporations, big corporations like, say, General Motors, don't have to pay a lot of health benefits for their employees because we have a publicly funded healthcare system in Canada. The US government, in some cases, tried to make arguments that the Canadian public healthcare system was actually a trade supplement that saved employers in Canada money when they hired workers. And so arguments might be made in the future to eliminate some of our social welfare programs on the basis of arguing that those programs were trade supplements. And that would certainly be a shame for the people who really need those services and resources. Theoretically speaking, policy making, or the development of social welfare policy, is often described as having a very, scientific method kind of approach, that there are particular actions that are taken before other actions are taken within the policy-making process. And while in some circumstances this may be true, in other cases the process of developing a particular policy and then the services and programs that roll out of that policy may be more reactive, more chaotic, or less linear in its approach. The linear model doesn't really acknowledge the fact that developing social policy is in part a process of power brokerage. Particular powerful interests can shape and change the decision-making around policy development. They can influence what we do and why we do it. The funnel causation model is more open to the recognition of power and talks about the idea that there are it's a kind of funnel down approach to developing policies and programs. Bureaucrats, politicians, and lobbyists have a very direct influence over the kinds of policies developed. And these are described as institutional factors. They're the pressure from above, if we understand, a power down kind of approach. But there are power up approaches or pressure from below that can also produce change within the system, or mitigate the power and influence of these most powerful people. And so citizen action, court rulings, or challenges to the charter are things that can be motivated from below, and these too can have an influence or a role to play in the development of policy. Community-based organizations, social movements, and other power from below organizations play an important role in the policy-making process. Now, many would argue that the role has been limited in recent years, but there is still a role for these organizations in the process of developing social policy. Hick describes the women's movement and LGBT communities as playing a very significant role in challenging and changing social policy in Canada. And these are just two organizations or two examples. If we look at same-sex marriage or gay rights, we know that LGBTQ community organizations used a variety of different approaches. They used, in some cases, direct action, so they engaged in street-level protests around issues. In other cases, they used the court system or challenges to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in order to make arguments about why the rights of individuals belonging to these communities were being infringed upon by government laws, rules, and regulations. And there's been quite a lot of success around this. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms certainly does provide unique opportunities for challenges. Another great example would be sex workers who have challenged the prostitution laws in Canada and at one point were successful in having them struck down. Or women's organizations who challenged the abortion law in Canada and again were successful in striking that legislation down. Hick minimizes the role that social workers have in this whole process, but in fact many social workers work as researchers who develop understandings of the experiences of people at the community level, and this research may be used to support changes in legislation or the development of new policies. Social workers also work organizing community members at the local level. If you look at the union movement, there's quite a few social workers who are involved in union organizing, and the unions have certainly had a role to play in changing social policy in Canada. And we also work as policy analysts for governments. So we may have opportunities to present particular kinds of material to government to influence or support particular approaches to policy. So I guess while social workers might not have as much power and control as we would like to think we do, there are places and spaces where we can get involved. And of course, we can also elect to get involved in civic society organizations like, for example, the women's movement or the LGBT community or the sex workers movement, and to support these organizations in their processes of lobbying for change. So this brings us to the end of our lecture. Thank you very much for participating in the lecture. You'll have more opportunities to think about social work and social policy when you take your social policy course a little bit later in the program. And if you're not in the social work program, well, maybe you want to transfer. Who knows? Anyway, I'll see you at the next video lecture. Thanks very much.